First, let's review the objectives for this lesson. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe the function of the skeletal system. You should be able to explain how bones are classified, explain how joints are classified, describe how the embryonic skeleton is replaced by bone, state the nutrients necessary for bone growth, name the hormones involved in bone growth and maintenance, identify the two major subdivisions of the skeleton, describe muscle structure in terms of muscle cells, tendons, and bones, describe the neuromuscular junction and explain the functions for each part, describe the structure of a sarcomere, describe the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction, explain polarization, depolarization, and repolarization in terms of ions and charges. Name the energy sources for muscle contraction. Explain the importance of hemoglobin, myoglobin, oxygen debt, and lactic acid. Let's get into it. The body's support framework consists of not only 206 bones, but also cartilage, tendons, and ligaments. Almost every muscle in the body attaches to bones at the joints. Muscle contraction results in the movement of bones at the joints. Bony structures provide protection for most vital organs, such as the skull, which covers the brain, and the rib cage that covers the heart, lungs, and the great vessels. The skeletal system also serves several vital functions: support and leverage, protection, storage, maintenance of calcium levels, and blood cell formation. Let's walk through these primary functions in greater detail. First off is protection. The skeletal system protects the vital organs and tissues by acting as a rigid barrier. For example, as previously discussed, the skull encases the brain, which shields it from impact. The rib cage protects the heart, the great vessels, and the lungs. The vertebrae protect the spinal cord, which is a crucial pathway for nerve signals. As far as storage is concerned, bones act as reservoirs for essential minerals and nutrients, like calcium and phosphorus, which are crucial for various bodily functions. Calcium is stored in bones, which is released into the bloodstream as needed to maintain physiologic balance. Fat is stored in the yellow marrow of the long bones, which serves as an energy reserve. Support. The skeleton provides a rigid framework that supports the body and maintains its shape. For example, the vertebral column supports the body's weight and allows for upright posture. Bones, like the pelvis and legs, also provide support for standing and walking. Leverage. Bones also act as levers, and joints act as fulcrums for muscles to generate movement. For example, the humerus and radius work with the biceps muscle to create leverage to allow for the elbow to provide and perform flexion. Maintenance of calcium levels. Bones play a critical role in regulating blood calcium levels, which are essential for the ability for muscles to contract, nerve signaling, and blood clotting. Examples of this occur when the hormone parathyroid hormone, or PTH, stimulates calcium release from the bones when blood levels are low. On the other hand, calcitonin helps deposit calcium into bones when levels are high. Lastly, blood cell production. Red bone marrow, which is found in certain bones, is the site of hematopoiesis, which is known as the formation of blood cells. As we know, red blood cells transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. White blood cells play a critical role in the immune response, and platelets aid in blood clotting. Bones like the pelvis, sternum, and femur all contain red marrow, especially in children and young adults. The location of that marrow eventually varies with age, but after the age of 4, blood cell production is limited to the areas such as the ribs, sternum, pelvis, skull, spinal column, and the proximal heads of the humerus and femur. So in summary, before we move on to cartilage, the musculoskeletal system is not just about movement. It serves a variety of essential functions, and we just named several of those. These functions interplay and work together to ensure that the body's ability to move, adapt, and maintain homeostasis is ensured. Moving on to cartilage. Cartilage is made up of shiny connective tissue that's lubricated by a substance known as synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is excreted by the synovial membrane during movement, and it provides a slippery surface over which bones may move freely. Synovial fluid also contains certain white blood cells that are important for the body's ability to fight infections and provide nourishment to the cartilage that covers the bone. There are actually many different types of cartilage within the body. There's elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage, but the most common that we see in the body is one that's called hyaline cartilage, which most commonly surrounds joints. Tendons and ligaments are both dense connective tissues that play vital roles in the musculoskeletal system, but they have distinct structures, functions, and characteristics. A couple of things to keep in mind that students often get confused are the differences between a sprain and a strain. A sprain occurs when ligaments are stretched or torn by a bone that is temporarily dislocated. A strain, on the other hand, occurs when muscle is pulled or stretched. Strains don't impact the ligaments at all. Let's go into a little bit more detail on some of those differences between tendons and ligaments. As it relates to function, tendons connect muscle to bone, and they transmit the force that's generated by muscle contraction to facilitate movement. On the other hand, ligaments connect bone to bone, and their role is to stabilize and support joints by limiting excessive or abnormal movement. In terms of composition, tendons and ligaments are pretty primarily composed of collagen fibers. Tendons, those collagen fibers are arranged in parallel bundles, which help provide strength and elasticity. But with ligaments, that collagen is a little bit more irregular, and that allows for the movement for multi-directional stability. In terms of elasticity, tendons are slightly elastic, allowing them to stretch and absorb force, which helps reduce the risk for injury. Ligaments, on the other hand, are less elastic than tendons, but have some degree of flexibility, which helps maintain some of the joint integrity. Location. Tendons are found at the ends of skeletal muscles, where they attach muscles to bones. For example, the Achilles tendon. On the other hand, ligaments are found at the joints, providing stability and limiting motion. For example, the anterior cruciate ligament in the knee. In terms of blood supply, tendons have a relatively low blood supply, which slows the healing process. Ligaments also have a limited blood supply, which can also affect their ability to heal after injury. And last, structure. Tendons are cord-like, and they have a linear structure suited to their function in force transmission, whereas ligaments are more band-like or sheet-like that are tailored to their role in stabilizing joints. I hope the diagram on the screen provides a little bit more understanding of some of the key differences between tendons and ligaments as it relates to their connection, their function, fiber arrangement, elasticity, location, and there are a couple of examples there to help you kind of paint those pictures clearly. The skeleton is divided into two distinct sections, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The main difference between the two is that the axial skeleton is made up of bones in the center of the body, the skull, vertebrae, rib cage, the long axis of the body, right? And it's designed to protect and support the body. Whereas the appendicular skeleton is made up of bones that attach to the limbs to the axial skeleton. They attach the limbs to the axial skeleton, which includes bones of the pectoral girdle, shoulders, arms, hands, and the pelvic girdle, which includes the pelvis, legs, and the feet. The appendicular skeleton enables the body to move. So axial skeleton provides protection and support. Appendicular allows the body to move. This table here represents the type of skeleton, whether it's the axial or the appendicular, and their associated bone sections and individual bones, if you were interested in comparing them all throughout the body. Bones are classified by their shape into four main types: long bones, short bones, flat bones, and sesamoid bones. Long bones are longer than they are wide. For example, the femur, tibia, fibula, ulna, radius, and humerus. Short bones are as broad as they are long, such as the bones in the wrist and the foot. Flat bones are exactly how they sound, thin and flat. These include the bones of the skull, ribs, sternum, and scapula. And lastly, the sesamoid bones are small and usually found in a tendon or muscle near a joint, like the patella, for instance, which is the medical term for the kneecap. Let's look a little closer at these four classifications of bones. Starting off with long bones. Long bones consist of a shaft, a diaphysis, an epiphysis, and a physis, otherwise known as the epiphyseal plate. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone, which is mostly made of compact bone. The epiphysis are the ends of the bone, which are mostly spongy type of bone. The metaphysis is the region between the diaphysis and the growth plate, or the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate is a thin disc of cartilage that allows the bone to grow longer. This is also known as the growth plate. And the medullary cavity, which you can see on the screen here, that's the inner cavity of the bone that contains the bone marrow. Overall, the functions of long bone is to support the body's weight, facilitate movement, and allow for interaction with the environment. The periosteum covers the outside of the bones, except for areas where ligaments and tendons attach, or where cartilage covers the bone. The periosteum is made up of two layers: a firm outer layer of collagen and reticular fibers, and an inner layer that can form bone. The endosteum lines the inside of the bones, and it covers the medullary cavity and the walls of the bone marrow cavity. The endosteum is a thin, vascular membrane of connective tissue that contains cells that help with bone development and remodeling. Now let's talk about short bones. Again, they're approximately equal in length, width, and thickness. Some examples include the carpals in the wrist. It is composed mostly of spongy bone tissue with a thin layer of compact bone on the outside. And these bones provide stability and limited movement. Flat bones. These are made up of a layer of spongy bone between two thin layers of compact bone. They are thin, usually not rounded, but sometimes often curved. Examples include the ribs, the sternum, the shoulder blades, the pelvis. The function of flat bones is primarily for protection and the ability for muscles to attach due to their broad surface area. Lastly, the sesamoid bones. These are small and round, similar to a sesame seed. That's where the name comes from. These act as a pulley to reduce friction and protect the tendon from excessive wear and tear. The patella is the most common example of sesamoid bones. They're usually found near the joints. Now let's talk about joints. A joint is a part of the body where two or more bones meet to allow for movement. There are 230 joints in the human body. Every bone in the body, except for the hyoid bone in the throat, meets up with at least one other bone at a joint. The shape of the joint depends on its function, and a joint is also known as an articulation, so you may hear that word used interchangeably. Joints can be classified by the degree of movement that they permit, and there are three broad classifications. Immovable joints, also known as synarthrotic, slightly movable joints, amphiarthrotic, and freely movable joints, diarthrotic. The three types of joints in the human body are known as fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. Fibrous joints are joints that are immovable. They are held together by dense connective tissue. A couple of examples include the sutures that connect the bones of the skull, and the gomphuses that connect the teeth to their sockets. Cartilaginous joints are mostly stable but allow for some movement. They are held together by cartilage, like the discs that separate the vertebrae. And lastly, synovial joints. These joints are freely movable and are the most common type of joint in the body. They're surrounded by a capsule of fluid known as synovial fluid, which lubricates the joint and allows for the joint to move. Examples include the shoulder, the elbow, the hip, and the knee. There are also sub-classifications of synovial joints. These include hinge joints, which move in one direction, like the joints in your fingers, elbows, and knees. There are ball and socket joints, which allow for rotation and turning in almost any direction, like the hips and the shoulders. There are pivot joints. These allow for rotation around an axis, like the joints in your neck vertebrae. Saddle joints. These can allow for angular movements in multiple directions, like the joint in your thumb. And plane joints. These allow for limited gliding movements, like the joints in your foot. And the last type are condyloid joints. These allow for angular movements, like the joint in your wrist. Bone growth and development, also called or also known as ossification, primarily occurs through two processes. Intramembranous ossification, which forms flat bones like those in the skull directly from connective tissue membranes. And endochondral ossification, where cartilage acts as a template for bone formation, happens in most of the long bones of the body. Both processes involve the activity of osteoblasts, which are bone building cells, and osteoclasts, bone reabsorbing cells, both of which are used to help remodel the bone structure throughout life. Let's go into a little bit more detail on these cells. So osteomites are mature bone cells that make up about 95% of bone cells in the adult skeleton. These cells respond to changes in pressure and tension in the bone. And these can also trigger a chemical reaction that alerts the osteoblasts and osteoclasts to start to repair damage. So they're really responsible for cell-to-cell communication. They kind of tell the bone creators and those who break down old bone tissue to get to work because there's an injury. Osteoblasts, that's the top cell on the top of the screen. These cells are involved in forming new bone and also repairing existing bone. They release bone matrix, which helps fill the gaps in the bone tissue. And osteoblasts also secrete a vital protein known as osteocalcin, which helps regulate things like insulin sensitivity, glucose metabolism, and even fat and lipid metabolism. This protein is really important because it also crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it can help regulate brain development. A couple of other features is that osteocalcin stimulates testosterone production in the male testes and can also be used to help diagnose certain metabolic bone diseases like osteoporosis and even bone tumors. Osteoclasts, these are from the same lineage as some of the white blood cells we're familiar with. Monocytes, macrophages, they're very similar. Osteoclasts adhere to bone and they release certain acids and enzymes that break bone down. Their lifespan is really only a couple of days, but it could take up to 3 months to replace the bone that was removed by an osteoclast. Osteoclasts have a cytoplasm with a foamy appearance due to the high concentration of vesicles and vacuoles that are used to remove damaged cells from bone. Let's talk a little bit more about bone development. In early development, bone formation begins during embryonic development, with mesenchymal cells forming a template for future bone structure. Epiphyseal plates, or growth plates, are the site for long bone growth, and growth primarily occurs here. Endochronal ossification process. This is where the cartilage cells within the growth plate proliferate and mature. Cartilage is calcified and then replaced by bone tissue that's produced by those osteoblasts. Then that bone lengthens as new bone is formed at the epiphyseal plate. Bone remodeling. Even after the growth of a bone stops, bones continue to remodel throughout life. Osteoclasts continue to break down old bone tissue, and osteoblasts continue to build new bone and maintain bone density in order to adapt to some mechanical stress. Ossification and osteogenesis. Really, the words are used interchangeably, right? They're both terms that refer to the process of bone formation. So ossification is the natural process of bone formation. Osteogenesis is the process of bone formation where osteo means bone, genesis means creation. So these words are often used interchangeably. Ossification begins in the embryo between the 6th and 7th weeks of development. It continues throughout life, especially during growth and to repair fractures. Ossification in different bones occurs at different rates, so it's something to be aware of. Let's talk a little bit about fractures. What happens when there's an injury? There are many types of bone fractures. There are open or compound fractures where the bone penetrates through the skin. There are closed or simple fractures where the bone doesn't penetrate the skin, but they're broken. And there are a couple of other distinct descriptions that are used to describe fractures, which is really just a word that means a breakage, right? A fracture is synonymous with a break. One of those descriptions is a green stick fracture. This is an incomplete break where the bone bends but doesn't break all the way through. This is pretty common in children because their bones are more flexible. A transverse fracture is a break that runs in a straight line across the bone. Complete separation, the bone is separated from one another. A compression fracture is a break that crushes the bone, making it appear flatter and wider. And a comminuted fracture is a break where the bone shatters into multiple pieces. There are a lot of other types of bone fractures: spiral fractures, oblique fractures, stress fractures, avulsions, buccal fractures. There are multiple different descriptions and names that are used for different types of fractures. I would recommend paying attention to the descriptions that are on the screen: green stick, transverse, compression, and comminuted. The treatment for most fractures is reduction. It's a realignment of that broken bone, which typically involves the requirement of a cast or traction to immobilize the bone to allow the bone to repair itself. Typically, as you age, the longer and more difficult it is for bones to heal. The process of bone repair, or fracture healing, has 3 overlapping stages: inflammation, pain, swelling, bone production, and remodeling. So in inflammation, bleeding occurs at the fracture site, whether you see it or not. If it's a closed fracture, the bleeding is going to happen internally. This leads to an immediate inflammation or an inflammatory response and immediate clotting to those areas, right? The body's responsible and wanting to stop bleeding when there is a hemorrhage. So the body will naturally inflame itself, will get white blood cells to those areas, and will get blood clots to form to slow bleeding down to avoid a patient from bleeding out. Bone production. A soft callus made of cartilage and fibrous tissue replaces the bone clot. Excuse me, the blood clot. Over time, the soft callus hardens into a hard callus. And over time, the remodeling stage sets in. That hard callus is replaced by new bone, and the bone is reshaped to its original form. And this can last over and could take several months or even years. Let's move into skeletal muscle. We talked a little bit about bones, how bones are made, what occurs when bones break, what's the repair process. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are also known as voluntary muscle. It's a tissue in the body that contracts to produce movement and support the body's structure. It's made up of muscle fibers and connective tissue, and it's found throughout the body. Skeletal muscles have many different functions. These functions include movement, where skeletal muscles contract to produce movement, posture, where these muscles contract to maintain posture, which is the body's position in response to gravity, the ability to maintain an upright posture, temperature regulation. These skeletal muscles help maintain body temperature, nutrient storage. Skeletal muscles store nutrients. Joint stabilization. So these muscles help stabilize joints and prevent them from twisting and bending inappropriately. Breathing. These muscles are used in the process of breathing, particularly the intercostal muscles. And swallowing. Skeletal muscles are involved in swallowing, in that swallowing reflex. Composition. Around skeletal muscles contains what's known as fascia, and it surrounds every muscle in the body. These skeletal muscles are also closely surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called epimysium. And muscles are separated into small compartments by a layer known as the perimysium. Just a few words that you should be aware of. How do skeletal muscles contract? Actin and myosin. These are two components and proteins that are found in muscle cells that form what's called a sarcomere. When myosin heads change shape, they create a force which causes the muscles to contract. A motor unit is made up of a motor neuron and muscle fibers that it controls. And when organelles and molecules bind myosin and actin to cause a pulling action, that is where contraction occurs, which is all transmitted through an impulse through a motor unit, all of which are connected to muscle fibers to allow for simultaneous contraction. What are some of the required chemicals? There are groups of myosin molecules that make up what's known as a myosin filament. Actin molecules attach to myosin cross bridges, and groups of many of these actin molecules twist and double strands to form an actin filament, which include proteins like troponin and tropomyosin. Troponin is a protein that promotes muscle contraction by binding to actin and moving tropomyosin away from the myosin binding sites. Calcium is an activator of troponin. Tropomyosin actually blocks muscle contraction by covering the myosin binding sites on actin, where calcium binds to troponin. Tropomyosin moves away from myosin binding sites, which allows for those actin and myosin filaments to form a cross bridge and trigger that contraction. A sarcomere. A sarcomere is what's known as the functional unit of skeletal muscle. Remember that a sarcomere is what is known as the actin and myosin filaments within. When a sarcomere shortens, that is when the skeletal muscles contract. They pull the sarcomeres together, skeletal muscle contracts, which is due to those cross bridges of the actin and myosin filaments pulling on the thin filaments of actin. Let's talk about the sliding filament theory. The sliding filament theory, which it was proposed in 1954 by Hugh Huxley and Gene Hansen. The theory explains how muscles contract by describing the movement of proteins within a muscle. So what's kind of a broad definition or a broad explanation? This model, the sliding filament theory or model, describes how thin actin filaments slide past the thick myosin filaments when within muscle fibers to generate force and movement. This process is a cycle of repetitive events that occurs within a sarcomere, which is the basic unit that controls muscle length. The process of contraction begins when an action potential reaches the muscle fiber. This triggers the release of calcium ions. These calcium ions bind to troponin, which causes a change in tropomyosin that exposes the myosin binding sites on the actin filaments. The myosin heads then bind to the actin filaments, generating force. This slide describes a short YouTube video that explains the sliding filament theory in about 2.5 minutes. So I urge you to click on that link to understand what this filament theory is, to better understand how muscle contraction works. A contraction stimulus refers to the electrical signal that's sent from a nerve to a muscle that triggers the muscle to contract. Essentially, this is when the nerve impulses act as the stimulus that initiate muscle contraction by releasing certain neurotransmitters at the neuromuscular junction, which causes those muscle fibers to slide together and shorten. When the charges are equal, the cell has depolarized, and the protein channels then close. Then the process of repolarization begins, which again creates that electrochemical gradient so that the cell can fire again. In muscle contraction, acetylcholine acts as the neurotransmitter that triggers muscle fibers to contract by binding to receptors on the muscle cell, while acetylcholinesterase is the enzyme responsible for rapidly breaking down acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft, ensuring the muscle relaxation after contraction occurs promptly. Essentially, acetylcholine initiates muscle contraction. Acetylcholinesterase terminates it by clearing away that neurotransmitter. Really important to understand how acetylcholine and how acetylcholinesterase work together to generate muscle contraction and muscle relaxation. So let's go through how acetylcholine is released. When the nerve impulse reaches the neuromuscular junction, it triggers the release of acetylcholine from the motor neuron in the synaptic cleft. Acetylcholine then binds to very specific receptors on the muscle cell membrane, which causes sodium channels to open, and that initiates an electrical signal within the muscle fiber. This electrical signal then travels through the muscle fiber, leading to the release of calcium ions, which ultimately causes the muscle to contract. To prevent the body and prevent those muscles from continuous contraction, an enzyme known as acetylcholinesterase quickly breaks down that neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine, in the synaptic cleft, which allows for that muscle to relax. We'll talk more about acetylcholine and acetylcholinesterase and how those are also important to understand the concept of organophosphate poisoning. You'll hear these terms again, so it's important to understand what acetylcholine is how it works as a neurotransmitter in our parasympathetic nervous system, and also understanding the enzyme that breaks acetylcholine down, which is acetylcholinesterase. Why is this clinically relevant? Well, there is a condition known as myasthenia gravis, which is an autoimmune disease. And this occurs when antibodies attack the acetylcholine receptors, which leads to impaired muscle contraction. Treatments for this disease often involve acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, which prolong the presence of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. So there are conditions that patients can have because certain receptors or certain antibodies attack those receptors. And that could lead to issues such as blurred vision, drooping eyelids, difficulty breathing, difficulty chewing or swallowing, weakness in the extremities, and muscle fatigue because the body isn't, and those muscles aren't able to contract appropriately. The energy source for muscle contraction is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP is stored in the muscle fibers, but the amount of ATP available is only enough for short contractions. To maintain contraction, AT must be constantly resynthesized from other sources. One source of ATP is through what's known as creatine phosphate, or CP. This is a quick source of ATP that's stored in muscle fibers. During low energy demand, excess ATP is transferred to creatine phosphate. Other types of storage include muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen is the primary source of carbohydrates that are used during intense exercise. Those can be converted into energy. Lipids are fatty acids that can also be used to generate ATP through aerobic respiration. There's anaerobic glycolysis. This typically occurs when oxygen supply is low. Pyruvate from glycolysis is converted to lactic acid, which also produces ATP, but in very little amounts. And then there's aerobic respiration. This occurs when there's sufficient amounts of oxygen. Pyruvate is used to generate 32 to 36 ATP in the mitochondria. Oxygen use and debt. Like we were just talking about, oxygen is required for the breakdown of glucose in the mitochondria. Remember from your cells, tissues, and membranes lecture what glycolysis is and what the Krebs cycle is, the electron transport chain, oxidative phosphorylation, right? That whole process of cellular respiration occurs in our cells. Our red blood cells carry oxygen, and then they bind to hemoglobin molecules. Myoglobin is what's known as the pigment that is synthesized in muscles that gives muscles their red or brown color. And these can combine with and temporarily store oxygen. Anaerobic respiration is required for energy when skeletal muscles are used for more than a minute or two. So when the body is working hard, when muscles are being used to work out, to run, to perform strenuous exercises, the body transitions to anaerobic respiration. Glucose that's broken down in glycolysis into pyruvic acid is then converted to lactic acid. And that lactic acid diffuses into the bloodstream and converts back into glucose by the liver. That lactic acid buildup is often what causes the pain and the soreness that develops in muscles when there's significant use. An oxygen debt itself develops when a person is exercising strenuously. Their body reduces the amount of oxygen required to ensure good muscle health. This is equivalent to the amount of oxygen that liver cells are required to convert the lactic acid into glucose, and the amount needed by the muscle cells to restore adequate amounts of ATP and creatine phosphate levels. And this can take several hours to convert lactic acid back into glucose. So it's a very long process. Oxygen is used mostly to synthesize that ATP, but that oxygen debt develops as lactic acid buildup increases. Muscle fatigue. Prolonged exercise may cause a muscle to become unable to contract. If you ever spent a long time in the gym on your first day there, and the next day you wake up and your muscles are really, really sore, right? This can also occur. And it can also occur perhaps due to a lack of blood supply, right? Or a lack of acetylcholine in the motor neuron axons. But the most common cause is the accumulation of lactic acid, which causes muscle fatigue. And this lowers pH levels, and the muscle fibers become less able to respond to stimulation and often leads to muscle cramps, soreness, and pain. Heat production. When a muscle contracts, it produces heat as a byproduct of the chemical reaction where ATP is broken down into ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, and inorganic phosphate, a process called ATP hydrolysis. This energy release is partially converted into heat, which helps contribute to the body's overall temperature regulation. Key points about muscle contraction and heat production are: one is to remember that during muscle contraction, the myosin protein binds to actin filaments, which pulls them closer together. And this process requires energy from ATP breakdown, which releases heat as a byproduct. When the body shivers due to a temperature drop, the nervous system triggers rapid muscle contractions, which we know as shivering, to generate heat through this mechanism. This heat that's generated by muscle contraction helps maintain the body's core body temperature and helps to maintain a normal body temperature within adequate ranges. Origins and insertions. When a muscle contracts, it pulls on its insertion point to create movement. The origin remains relatively stationary, serving as the anchor for this action. These points are typically connected to bones via tendons, which are strong connective tissues. Origins, for example, we'll use the bicep brachii as an example of an origin and an insertion. So the biceps brachii actually has two origins. There's the long head, which is the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, and the short head, the coracoid process of the scapula. The insertion is the radial tuberosity of the radius and the bicipital aponeuris. The action, when the biceps brachii contracts, the insertion on the radius is pulled closer to the origin on the scapula, which causes flexion, otherwise known as bending of the arm. Extension, on the other hand, is movement that straightens an arm. So a couple things to remember. Origins and insertions can vary depending on the muscle and its function. We talked about the biceps brachii, but there are other areas where this occurs. Knowing these origins and insertions can help understand how muscles produce specific movements and how they interact with their local joints and bones. Skeletal muscles interact through coordinated actions that enable smooth and efficient movement. These interactions involve three primary roles: the prime mover, or the agonist, synergists, and antagonists. The prime mover, known as the agonist, is responsible for producing a specific movement. This is when muscles contract. These are muscles that contract. Example, when the arm bends, the biceps brachii acts as a prime mover, as it contracts to flex the elbow and bring the forearm upward toward the upper arm. Synergists, these are muscles that assist the prime mover by adding force or stabilizing nearby joints to ensure efficient movement. For example, the brachialis is synergist with the elbow flexion. The brachialis and the brachioradialis are both synergists during elbow flexion, and they help the biceps brachii by providing additional force and ensuring smooth flexion. Antagonists are muscles that oppose the action of the prime mover. They relax or lengthen during the movement, but can contract to return the limb to its original position or control the motion. For example, the triceps brachii is the antagonist during elbow flexion. It relaxes to allow the biceps brachii to contract, but can contract to extend the elbow back to its original position. So here we have an example. When you bend your arm to lift an object, the biceps brachii, the prime mover, contracts, shortening to pull the forearm upward. The brachialis and brachioradialis are synergists, and they assist by contributing additional force and stabilizing the joint. Meanwhile, the triceps brachii serves as the antagonist, and this allows for the muscle to relax. Now let's talk about smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is a type of involuntary muscle tissue that's found in various parts of the body, like the walls of hollow organs, like the stomach, intestines, and blood vessels. Unlike skeletal and cardiac muscle, smooth muscle is non-striated, meaning it lacks the organized bands of sarcomeres that's seen in other tissue and muscle types. Smooth muscle cells are spindle-shaped. They have a single nucleus and contract involuntarily under the control of the autonomic nervous system, hormones, and local stimuli. Characteristics of smooth muscle. So typically, in terms of structure, smooth muscle is non-striated, spindle-shaped cells with a single nucleus. The control is involuntary and it's regulated by the autonomic nervous system, hormones, and other intrinsic factors. The contraction is pretty slow and sustained, but often rhythmic, and can maintain tension for long periods of time. And again, these are found in the walls of hollow organs, intestines, uterus, blood vessels, etc. There are two types of smooth muscle. Visceral smooth muscle is found in the walls of hollow organs, and it's composed of cells that are connected by gap junctions that allow electrical signals and ions to flow between them. They function as a single unit. When one cell contracts, the signal spreads to adjacent cells, resulting in a coordinated contraction of the entire muscle. They often exhibit rhythmic contractions, or known as peristalsis, as seen in the digestive system. The control is pretty much under the influence of the autonomic nervous system and responds hormonal and mechanical to stimuli. An example is the intestines use visceral smooth muscle for peristalsis, which is that rhythmic flow or rhythmic contractions that move food along the digestive tract. The other type of smooth muscle is multi-unit smooth muscle, and this is found in the walls of large blood vessels, the airways of the lungs, the iris of the eye, and the erector pili muscles, responsible for the goosebumps. It's composed of individual muscle fibers that operate independently of each other. There are few or no gap junctions. Each fiber is innervated separately, which allows for more precise and localized control. Contractions are often not synchronized, but instead occur in response to specific neural and hormonal signals. It's heavily influenced by the autonomic nervous system, with each muscle fiber receiving its own innervation. For example, the iris of the eye uses multi-unit smooth muscle to adjust pupil size in response to light levels. This table on the screen provides a few more differences between visceral smooth muscle and multi-unit smooth muscle that are important to understand as it relates to smooth muscle. And the last type of muscle we're going to talk about is cardiac muscle, which is a special type of muscle found exclusively in the heart. Its primary job is to contract rhythmically and continuously to ensure that blood is pumped throughout the body. Cardiac muscle has unique structural and functional features that enable it to fulfill this role effectively. It combines properties of both skeletal and smooth muscle, but also has distinct characteristics. Cardiomyocytes are known as the cardiac muscle cells, and they're striated and they look like skeletal muscle. The intercalated discs are branching fibers between cells and protein-lined ion channels that allow action potentials to pass from one cell to another. These also contain gap junctions and desmosomes. Each cell typically has one or two nuclei, and they're involuntarily controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Cardiomyocytes rely heavily on aerobic metabolism and contains many mitochondria to meet the high energy demands of the cardiovascular system. This table on the screen provides a comparison chart between cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle. As you can see, the locations of these different types of muscles is different. The structure is different. How it's controlled by the body is different. The contraction speed varies. Its coordination varies. The energy they use, although primarily aerobic in all types of skeletal muscle, some use anaerobic. They're all innervated by the nervous system, some by the autonomic, others by the somatic nervous system. And there are some examples of each of those types of those muscles there at the bottom. Thank you for listening to this pre-recorded content on the musculoskeletal system. While we did not review specific bones and their locations and specific types of muscles and the names of muscles, that information can be found within your anatomy and physiology textbook. And we urge you to take a look so you're able to identify the most common bones that make up the complex systems that we call our musculoskeletal system. Thank you. First, let's review the objectives for this lesson. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe the function of the skeletal system. You should be able to explain how bones are classified. Explain how joints are classified. Describe how the embryonic skeleton is replaced by bone. State the nutrients necessary for bone growth. Name the hormones involved in bone growth and maintenance. Identify the two major subdivisions of the skeleton. Describe muscle structure in terms of muscle cells